Hello, Linden. It's Larry Bash again, representing the Department of Parks and Recreation in the City of Linden. We are continuing with our senior citizen lecture series. Not that we're excluding people that aren't senior citizens, but we have geared this primarily for senior citizens. Believe it or not, this is the last of our 6 spring lectures. Whether we're going to do anything in the summer or maybe start again in the fall, I'm not sure yet. I think if you keep checking the website and the Parks and Recreation people, they'll let you know. Hopefully there could be a time when we'll be able to have these sessions in person so we can have some interchange and debate, discussion. I've always had a lot of fun with the groups that have been meeting here at the Gregorio Center, which is just a terrific facility. If we can get through this global pandemic, maybe by the summer, maybe by the fall, it would be terrific, because this would be a lot more fun if everyone was here. Now remember, I'm happy to give you my email address if you have questions, because you're going to watch this at a specific time. You're not going to have a way to raise questions. If you want to raise them with me directly, as several people have, you're welcome to email me. It's Larry Bash, LARRYBASHE @AOL.com, and I will answer your question in real time, even if it's well after the session as it appears on the public TV. And remember, what the city does is it puts the talk on YouTube. So if you miss the scheduled event, although many people are telling me they're making the schedule, the schedule is on the website, you can check it. You can always catch it on YouTube. And once again, if you have questions, you can email me and I'll answer them as best I can. Some people email me with a statement or two, and believe it or not, there are occasionally people that disagree with my conclusions, which it's fun to talk through. Unfortunately, we can't do it face to face. Our last topic is not one that was recently brought up by the group. It's one that came up when we had a course last year on the history of U.S. presidential elections, and there was a request that we do something to talk about the effect of third parties on U.S. presidential elections. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I encourage you to register for these lectures, because then we can send out for you the supporting materials. For instance, I can give you some data in a handout. Ordinarily, if we're meeting face-to-face, I would hand it to you as you're at the event. I have no way of doing that on the public TV. So if you register, we can mail you that information, and you have it. And I think there are times when it enhances the whatever's to be gained from these lectures. Many times it's not necessary to get something out of the lecture, but sometimes it's helpful. And so I think it's worth it to register at Parks and Recreation Bureau, Department of Parks and Recreation on the City of Linden website. Our system of electing presidents is an indirect method. We had, people may recall, we had a whole session on the Electoral College system. This works to a definite disadvantage for third parties, because it's an all or nothing system. You could win state of Ohio by 1 vote and you will get all their Electoral College votes. There are 2 states in the country, Nebraska and Maine, that do proportional Electoral College. Now that is an opportunity for a third party, because they can gather enough to get some Electoral College votes. And we're going to go through the record of third parties, why they were formed, what their positions were, and the contrast between electoral and popular votes. Some of the largest popular vote getters for independent candidates got no Electoral College votes because it wasn't enough to take any one state. What I want to do to start out, however, is to go through the development of the political party system particularly to the point when some of these third parties started developing. The original U.S. Constitution did not contemplate political parties. The Founding Fathers were hopeful that there wouldn't be political parties. They saw the system in Great Britain, they didn't like it. They really thought we were going to have good people operate as electors and select a good person to be president. And they thought they built in protections against a mistake in selecting a U.S. president, and a way to get rid of them if we chose the wrong person. Of course, the U.S. At their time was much smaller, simpler. We were primarily an agricultural community. We didn't really start an industrialization process until post-Civil War in the 1800s. And life wasn't nearly as complicated. However, they could see political parties developing as they were debating the Constitution. Remember, the Constitution was the replacement for the ineffectual Articles of Confederation, which didn't really work very well, mostly because there wasn't enough central control. There wasn't a way to raise funds of the central government, and it was too weak. The dynamic that went on throughout the process was central control and authority versus individual rights. But even the people that were big advocates for individual rights recognized the Articles of Confederation were not working. But the dynamic going on really developed into what would be our first political parties. The group of leaders like George Washington, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton began to be known as Federalists because it was a Federalist system that was built into the U.S. Constitution. And when they put together arguments for approving the new Constitution, the main method of convincing people was called the Federalist Papers. They weren't official documents, even though even now we have Supreme Court decisions that cite the Federalist Papers. It was the advocacy for adopting the Constitution. And we have a better understanding of what the Founding Fathers intended because of the minutes primarily kept by James Madison. The authors of the Federalist Papers were primarily Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison. So the people that were arguing for the federal setup and the Constitution as it existed coming out of the convention started to be called Federalists. And the part of the Founding Fathers that were arguing for more protections of individual rights in the constitutional document became known as Democratic Republicans, interestingly enough. And they were led primarily by Thomas Jefferson. James Madison was more on even though he was a big author of the Federalist Papers, he was more aligned with Thomas Jefferson. So eventually, one of the first questions you might ask when you're opening up your history book is, how come we had to amend the Constitution so frequently, so soon after it was adopted? Well, that's because of the deal that was struck for support. So people like Thomas Jefferson had a guarantee from the people we called the Federalists that they would address individual rights in a separate Bill of Rights. We call it the Bill of Rights now. It was 10 amendments, immediate amendments of the Constitution. Now, there were more than 10 that were proposed. There were 20-some. Some of them didn't make it. But we have the 10 that were, and true to their word, they were adopted very soon after the Constitution was adopted. But approving the Constitution was not a sure thing. I mean, actually, 2 states could not participate in the first presidential election because they hadn't approved the Constitution yet. That was Rhode Island and North Carolina. But it's sort of interesting that they trusted each other to move ahead and not wait. Part of it was the urgency of changing from the Articles of Confederation that really weren't working. So, the Founding Fathers turn around in a few years and discover, hey, there are a couple of political parties here, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists were very successful at accomplishing the objectives they set out. The first president elected was a Federalist, George Washington. The second president was also a Federalist. John Adams was George Washington's vice president. And when he ran for re-election, he lost to a Democratic Republican, Thomas Jefferson. And that dynamic, central versus individual rights, continued through into the 1820s. By then, the Federalist Party had virtually disappeared. And the candidates in the ballot for president were really the same party, Democratic Republicans. The election of 1824 was the first time we had a popular vote for president, so that the electors were chosen by popular vote. And ironically enough, the candidate, there were multiple candidates, all same party. The candidate that won the most popular votes and the most electoral votes did not get elected president because his electoral vote total was less than a majority needed. And then they had a system where it was kicked into the House of Representatives, and then, which creates an amazing opportunity for cutting deals. Last week we talked about the U.S. presidential election of 1948, and in that, a group that stepped away from the Democratic Party and called them the States' Rights Party. Their whole objective was to obtain enough electoral votes to not allow to push the election into the House, and they felt they could deal with the two sides, primarily two sides, of Republicans and Democrats, and cut the best deal they could, and then support that candidate for president, Tom Dewey or Harry Truman. So electoral college politics has been with us forever, because it creates opportunities for these kinds of outcomes. And there have been a few cases where the popular vote does not match the electoral vote. We had it in 2000, we had it in 2016. And we almost had it in, as we discussed last week, in 1948. So when the candidate that I described as having more popular votes and electoral votes but not becoming president was Andrew Jackson, who was livid, resigned from his position in the Senate, and worked for 4 years to undermine the president, John Quincy Adams, who got elected through the House of Representatives by cutting a deal with another candidate who threw his support to him in return for being named Secretary of State. At that critical time period when Andrew Jackson, who was a very polarizing political leader, and very much a populist, very much a creature of the Western expansion of the U.S. states, he changed the Democratic Party to become the Democratic Party as opposed to Democratic Republican. He had the first Democratic Party convention that nominated him in 1832. He was a big proponent for having primary elections. But at that point in time, there really was only one political party. What happened was Andrew Jackson became so polarizing that there was a party formed specifically as an anti-Andrew Jackson party. Tied to it also was a position of anti-slavery, and that was the Whig Party. They started running in the 1830s. Ironically, they were successful in electing two presidents in the 1840s, both of whom died in office, William Henry Harrison and Zachary Taylor, both former generals. And the primary, I don't really call the Whigs a third party because they became the second party. They kind of faded away pre-Civil War, and many Whigs joined the Republican Party, which was formed in 1854. They had a candidate for president in 1856 who lost, James Fremont. He lost to James Buchanan, the Democrat. And of course, then we had the historic campaign of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Since that time forward, there have been two major political parties, Republican and Democrat. Their policies, their approach to issues has dramatically changed over the years, but there's still the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. Then we start measuring, okay, who are these third party people? Often it got the third party activity got very active pre-Civil War, and a lot of it dealt with economic policy and slavery, policy on slavery. You had third parties that were going to leave slavery alone, but they didn't want it to expand into the Western territories that were becoming states. You had anti-slavery people that were abolitionists who wanted to eliminate slavery, much as Great Britain had done in the 1830s. And you had people who defended slavery and wanted to keep it as, because it was part of their way of life. And the dynamic here is some of these third-party candidates, they may have been against slavery, but they were willing to live with it to preserve the Union. And that was a common approach. And there were plenty of people against slavery. There were plenty of people that didn't want to expand slavery. But there were also people who, said the preservation of the Union was more important than the issue of slavery. Then, over time, third parties became more of tied to a specific issue, often economics. We started to have an active Socialist party. We had prohibition parties. We had parties that were advocates for a specific issue. And as I say, in presidential politics, it was hard for them to gain any ground because of the electoral college system. It's winner take all. So you have to win a state to get the election. So we had plenty of candidates, third-party candidates, that got a lot of popular votes, but no electoral college votes. And some got some electoral college votes. The most dramatic and successful third-party candidacy was in the election of 1912. We discussed this previously when we discussed the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, because he was the primary beneficiary of a split in the Republican Party. We had Theodore Roosevelt, who took office as president when William McKinley was assassinated. He ran on his own. He became president early in McKinley's second term, which is 1900. He ran on his own in 1904 and won. And then his successor was a political ally, William Howard Taft, who won in 1908. They had a little bit of a falling out, Taft and Roosevelt, So when it came time in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt decided he wanted to run for president. He competed for the Republican nomination. He won most of the primaries, but the political party was controlled by the incumbent president, William Howard Taft, so he got the nomination. Theodore Roosevelt was disaffected enough that he formed something that we have called in the past the Bull Moose Party, but it really was officially called the Progressive Party. He ran in the election of 1912, and you had kind of an aberration in which Woodrow Wilson, the first Democrat to win the presidency in the post-Civil War era, except for Grover Cleveland in the 1800s, and he won only because the Republican Party was split. But Theodore Roosevelt, in his Progressive Party, is the most successful of the third-party candidates we've experienced. He got over 4 million votes, more than the incumbent president, and he got many more electoral votes than the incumbent president. He got 88 electoral votes. The incumbent president only carried 2 states with 8 electoral votes. And Woodrow Wilson won the popular vote and by far the electoral college vote. Now, if you added up the popular vote of the 2 Republicans, Theodore Roosevelt and President Taft, you would have more popular votes for the Republicans than Woodrow Wilson. But of course, that's not the way it works. So there have been examples, not a lot, where third-party candidates have gotten electoral college votes, usually on a specific kind of issue. Let's see. I have for you in material, if you register and we can send it out to you, examples of candidates that won electoral votes that were third-party candidates. And I have a list of the most popular votes obtained by third-party candidates. And the most popular votes often had no electoral college votes, because again, you have to win enough to win a state to get the electoral college vote. But the third-party candidates that attract a lot of votes could affect the election, obviously, because they can take votes away from one or the other of the presidential candidates. So I gave you a list in the material that I have included for you of, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 third-party presidential candidates that got some electoral college votes. I guess 10 would be Theodore Roosevelt, who got 88, the most. The closest that comes to that total is in 1860, in that interesting election that Abraham Lincoln won, and that we talked about at one of our lectures. We talked about the presidency of Abraham Lincoln, and particularly how he won the election in 1860 with over a split Democratic Party. He was in the new Republican Party. And then he won re-election while there was a Civil War going on, which is sort of an amazing story. So the Democratic Party split led to 3 candidates that got some electoral votes. The traditional Democratic candidate, Stephen Douglas, got a small number of electoral college votes, and I don't remember the number, but it was in the neighborhood of 10, 11, 12, something like that. The Southern Democrats that broke off ran a man named John Breckinridge, who was the vice president at the time under James Buchanan. He got 72 electoral votes, and then there was another third party called the Constitutional Union Party, Joseph Bell, who got 38 some electoral votes. And this was an example of a candidate who, above all, supported maintaining the Union. He did not care about slavery. If you had to live with slavery in order to keep the Union together, that was a price he was willing to pay. You have Robert La Follette, a senator from Wisconsin who ran as a progressive in 1924. That's the election in which Calvin Coolidge, who had succeeded Warren Harding when Warren Harding died in office, and he ran as a progressive. He got a fair number of popular votes, but only one state, his home state of Wisconsin. So he had 13 electoral college votes. Last week we discussed the election of 1948. Strom Thurmond, he led a group of Southern Democrats who split off from the Democratic Party. They called themselves the States' Rights Party. He only carried 3 states, less than he thought, and many observers thought. It was 39 electoral votes, but it was South Carolina, Alabama, and Louisiana. So he got a fair number of popular votes, and he got some electoral college votes, but he didn't accomplish what he was aiming for, and that was to take enough electoral college votes to throw the election into the House of Representatives, where he could cut a deal with either the Republican Thomas Dewey or the Democrat Harry Truman. George Wallace, governor of Alabama, states' rights, a lot of resistance to civil rights laws, and he ran to get the Democratic nomination, was not successful. 1968, the Democratic nominee, amidst all the turmoil of 1968, ended up being Hubert Humphrey. So George Wallace got 46 electoral votes. So there are a small number of candidates that have gotten electoral college votes, but not much in the way of popular votes, and not nearly enough electoral college votes. Again, the most successful was Theodore Roosevelt, which was a former president, and very well known and loved Republican. And he was very successful in political primaries in the Republican Party, but he was, in his words, cheated out of the nomination by the party regulars who renominated the incumbent president, William Howard Taft. I did a little analysis of the popular vote as a percentage of the vote by third-party candidates. I think it's sort of interesting. There's a couple of former presidents, Martin Van Buren, who was the vice president under Andrew Jackson, and then got elected president in 1836, lost in re-election, became a free soil candidate and got 10% of the vote in 1848, well after the time that he was president. And Millard Fillmore, who actually got 22% of the popular vote. He was a former president, and he may sound familiar to you. He took office when Zachary Taylor died. He was a Whig. And at the time, he helped create the American Party, or what was often known as the Know Nothing Party. Eugene Debs was a fourth candidate in that 1912 election. He's a socialist. The Socialists ran candidates and got a fair number of popular votes, but never got any electoral college votes. But in 1912, he got 6% of the vote. George Wallace had 14% of the vote, not a small number. And then, if you think back, if you remember in 1980, when Jimmy Carter was a pretty unpopular incumbent president, he was running against Ronald Reagan as a Republican, and Jimmy Carter was a Democrat. So a big independent party formed, and their candidate was John Anderson, who was a representative from Illinois. And he got a big popular vote, 7% of the vote, but no electoral college votes. And then the candidate we probably remember the most when we think of third parties is Ross Perot. He had a party that he called the Reform Party, and his high water mark was in 1992. That's the election in which Clinton ran against the incumbent President George Bush Sr. And in 1992, Ross Perot took 19% of the vote. That's a big number. And then, now, no doubt in 92, he helped Clinton win the election. Well, Clinton had less than 50% of the vote, but won the Electoral College vote and defeated an incumbent president, which is not an easy thing to do. And George Bush Sr. was the first sitting vice president to get elected president since Martin Van Buren back in 1836. Reason being that it's tough when you're running representing the incumbent party, but you're not the incumbent. Many people looked at Martin Van Buren winning in 1836 as being the third term of Andrew Jackson, in much the same way George Bush Sr. was seen as winning the third term for Ronald Reagan. So Ross Perot dipped a bit in 1996. He still ended up with 8% of the vote. Now, if you remember, in 1996, Ross Perot got in, campaigned, got out, and then came back in again. And that was part of his problem of not doing better and not doing as well as he did in the previous election. So if you look at the popular vote, the highest popular vote of the third-party candidate was, as you might expect, was Ross Perot in 1992. He had over 19 million votes. That's a lot of votes. Remember, he didn't get any electoral college votes, but he won almost 20% of the popular vote for president. That's a pretty impressive accomplishment. But there's nobody close to him in terms of the number of popular votes. George Wallace did well, the American Independent Party. He got almost 10 million votes and a small number of electoral college votes from the South. The third highest popular vote total was Ross Perot in 1992, and he got almost 8 million votes, a lot of votes, but not as well as he did the previous election, largely because he went through this flip-flop of being in, being out, and then coming back in again. Then, does anyone remember the John Anderson campaign? He was an independent. In 1980, we talked about him a minute ago. He was there because Republicans were nervous about Ronald Reagan, and Democrats didn't like Jimmy Carter, so that's where he drew votes from. And, he had over 5.7 million votes. It's a lot of votes. No electoral college votes. So going down the line, Ralph Nader in 2000, remember him, the Green Party? He definitely affected the 2000 campaign because he siphoned votes away from Al Gore in Florida. But his overall vote total was close to 3 million votes, but no electoral votes. Eugene Debs, the Socialist, got almost 1 million votes in 1920. In 1912, he had slightly fewer than that, even though he was a socialist. In the Millard Fillmore, as in the Know Nothing Party, got almost 900,000 votes in 1856. That's the year that Buchanan won over the first Republican candidate for president, John Fremont. The Prohibition Party ran candidates for president from 1880 until 1948 and never achieved any electoral votes. The social parties has run candidates for president since 1892 and never had a candidate with electoral college votes. Eugene Debs and Norman Thomas were socialist candidates for president, a combined total of 10 times. No electoral college votes. Several third-party candidates influenced the election, but didn't come close to carrying any state or getting much more than a few votes. Others, I mean, I think we can definitely say that the election of 2000, the election of 1948, and others had an influence in the election, although the third-party candidate really never came close to winning the presidency. And it would be hard to do in our electoral college system because of the winner-take-all format. Now, what I'd like to do is talk about some of these parties a little bit more in the context, what their issues were, why they formed. Again, that pre-Civil War period, there was a lot of political turmoil, post Andrew Jackson particularly. You know, we had 6 consecutive elections in which no president served more than one term. Kind of an unusual stretch. Part of it was we had 2 presidents during that time period that died in office, and their successors were not very successful. The anti-Mason Party was the original conspiracy theory party. And they were primarily designed to oppose Andrew Jackson. And what they referred to as the Secrecy Society Masons. It was formed in part because of the upheaval associated with industrialization and Western expansion, among other issues. And they had the first political convention to nominate a president in 1831. That's the model that Andrew Jackson used in 1832 to be re-nominated for his re-election campaign. And of course, since then, we have conventions for all kinds of parties. They were very much anti-President Jackson, Andrew Jackson, and particularly when he ran for re-election in 1832. Most of its members became Whigs after the presidential election of 1832, and part of that was anti-slavery. The American Party, whose candidate was Millard Fillmore, and better known as the Know Nothing Party, was active in the 1840s and the 1850s, mostly over opposition to immigration. They were complaining how immigration was changing the nature of our society. Kind of rings a little familiar to us, I think. Their main targets were Chinese and Japanese immigrants on the West Coast and Irish and Italian immigrants on the East Coast. There was a very strong strain of anti-Catholic bias in this Know Nothing Party. They might have become Republicans, except they did not oppose slavery. And when Millard Fillmore ran, a former president, ran on that Know Nothing ticket in 1856, he carried one state, the state of Maryland. So he did get some electoral college votes. The Constitutional Union Party, which we referred to in the election of 1860, were largely former Whigs whose top priority was preserving the Union. They were happy to live with slavery if necessary, and they were concerned about challenging slavery because it might lead to dissolution of the Union and or a civil war. Their candidate in 1860 was John Bell. He was from Tennessee. He was one of 4 candidates that got electoral college votes. Remember, if you remember, Abraham Lincoln won that election, and he did it by capturing a lot of Western expanded states in the Midwest. There was a party called the Free Soil Party that we referred to before. They ran candidates for president in 1848 and 1850, and their main plank was they opposed expansion of slavery into the Western territories. That was a very nice fit with the Republican Party, and they ended up joining the Republican Party when the Republican Party first ran a candidate for president. That was John Freeman. He lost to John Buchanan, who was the Democrat from Pennsylvania. Ever hear of the Greenback Party? It was named after a currency that was established to help pay for the Civil War. It was not supported by anything, no gold standard, no nothing, just a promise to pay. It was backed by people who supported inflation. It's hard to wrap your mind around that, but there were parts of the economy, farmers particularly, that benefited from inflation. And their issue always was with the bankers and the merchants in New England who favored hard currency and tight money. The farmers preferred inflation. The William Jennings Bryan candidacy, he 3 times he ran for president, was largely based on that. Remember the line about you shall not crucify man on a cross of gold. That's because he advocated for multi-metal backing of currency, silver primarily. But the whole point was they favored more inflationary policies, less tight money and hard currency. They ran presidential candidates, this is the Greenback Party, in 1876 to 1884, but never won any electoral college votes. We talked about the Progressive Party or the Bull Moose Party. That was Teddy Roosevelt, and that their success was definitely tied to him and the fact that the Republican Party chose to ignore the will of the people in the Republican Party and renominated their incumbent president, William Howard Taft. Also called the Progressive Party was Robert La Follett's crusade in 1824 against the sort of laissez-faire economics of the Republican Party post-World War I. The Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge folks, the people who helped create the Great Depression that undermined Herbert Hoover, who was the recipient of the problem, not the creator of the problem. John Anderson, we talked about, he ran what was called the Independent Party, and he got a lot of votes. People who were Republicans who were afraid of Ronald Reagan, and Democrats who didn't like Jimmy Carter. He got 5.7 million votes. That's a lot of votes, but no electoral college votes. And I mentioned in there that his vice president was former Wisconsin Governor Patrick Lucey. The Reform Party was Ross Perot, and he ran twice. He did very well. His big issues were stopping deficit spending. He was very much against NATO and free trade. He was also fiscal austerity. I don't know if anyone remembers those talks he gave or the debates he participated in. To look back today, it was pretty entertaining. He was pretty effective. He was a private citizen, private businessman who had no government experience, and that was one of his attractions to people. Subsequent to that, people like Donald Trump and Patrick Buchanan and Ralph Nader tried to get the nomination of the Reform Party. Patrick Buchanan actually ran as a Reform candidate in one election. You remember Jesse Ventura, the wrestler? He was elected governor of Minnesota, running as a candidate of this party. And then there's the Green Party. We think primarily of Ralph Nader, who in 2000 really got a lot of votes, almost 3 million votes, no electoral college votes. And he really affected the election because his participation in it hurt Al Gore. That is a capsule summary of the activities associated with independent candidates in the U.S. presidential elections. It's something we touched on when we had our course on the history of U.S. presidential elections. And people had asked at the time that we spend more time on that issue. What we just went through was a very brief summary of involvement of third parties. It's going to be very hard for any third party candidate to crack the electoral college system because of the winner-take-all nature of it and the infrastructure that's developed around the two major political parties. Since the election of 1856 and the subsequent election of Abraham Lincoln as a Republican in 1860, they've been the two main political parties, even though their positions on some issues have reversed themselves. Free trade is an example, which was a Democratic issue when the Democrats were dominated by Southern farmers, became, and the Republicans favored tariffs, and it was a part of the industrialization effort. Their roles have virtually reversed. So the Democrats were more willing to have protectionism to protect American jobs, where Republicans now are supporting, as a business agenda, free trade because it adds economic activity and contributes to our GNP. Well, I hope this was helpful. This is the last of our spring lectures. I'm not sure if we're going to do anything in the summer, maybe in the fall. I would check the website to see what plans the Parks and Recreation people will have. So in the meantime, be safe, and I'm hoping that we can get together sometime in the near future to discuss some of these issues that are of interest to our senior citizens in the city of Linden. Thank you.